r/NoSleep. Posted by u/Bryony97. I picked up a faceless hitchhiker. Normally, I don't pick up hitchhikers. By rule, I don't think it's worth the risk when, if someone truly needs a ride, they can call an Uber or Lyft and be off in 10 minutes. However, while on a quick snack run last month, I made the mistake of breaking my rule when I approached a young woman who was walking alone in the pouring rain. At first, I fully intended to drive by as I would have with any other person. She must have noticed me driving up because right as I came up on her, she spun around, nearly jumped in front of my car, and frantically waved her arms for me to stop. As I screeched to a halt, she ran up to my driver's side window and started on a tangent about how her phone died and how she was still 6 miles from home. Her face was obstructed by a mask, oversized hat, and dark glasses, so I couldn't glean any semblance of sincerity from her facial expressions, but I could hear the desperation in her voice. Dumb of a decision as it was, I didn't feel right letting her walk home in the rain without a phone when she was clearly begging for help. This is on top of the fact that I didn't exactly have anywhere else to be at 1 a.m. I opened the door, and almost as soon as she entered the car, she asked for me to go straight. As I drove, I tried to make conversation with the stranger, but I never could get an actual response. The only reply I'd received was, "I'd like to go home. Please help me get home." Eventually, I just gave up entirely. After around 10 minutes of driving straight, I asked if I was supposed to be turning anywhere but was met with silence. I turned towards the woman for a brief moment to repeat my question but instead slammed on the brakes when I laid eyes on her. All the items covering her face had been removed to reveal a completely smooth surface. The only hint at some approximation of a face was the slight rise and fall of veiny skin where her mouth would have been, almost as if she was imitating breathing. Instinctually, I put the car into park and moved to run out, but before I could even touch the handle, a large hand clamped around my arm and held me in place. I was close to having a full-blown panic attack, but she raised a gnarled finger to non-existent lips and made a quiet tch sound. When she spoke, her voice had taken on a much more gravelly tone, and the pressure from her vice grip forced me to take every word with the utmost respect. "You will not leave," she stated. "You must drive. You no longer have a choice." When she released her grip, I didn't say a word. I didn't even want to comment on the apparent bruising on my arm for fear she'd do much worse if I complained. I simply exhaled, put the car into drive, and kept going. We must have driven for another half hour. She'd occasionally tell me to make a turn here or there. Still, after about 15 minutes, I knew we were headed towards the more rural parts of the county, an area where people were known to go missing. With every glance in her direction, I could see her featureless face was trained on me. It was as if she was observing me, not entirely sure of whether or not she could trust I'd take her wherever she'd wanted to go, and as soon as that trust was broken, it would very quickly be over for me. Eventually, she instructed me to pull up to a lone rundown house just off the highway. The windows were boarded up, and I could see piles of trash strewn about the exterior. When we stopped in front of it, she told me to get out. An unconscious shake of my head prompted her to slam her giant fist on the dashboard, cracking the plastic. Without argument, I walked out into the cold night. She followed behind and pointed at the house. In silence, we walked into the decaying building and were immediately met with a groan. I shined my phone's flashlight forward and saw what appeared to be a homeless man writhing around on the ground in pain. He was foaming at the mouth, and his eyes were bloodshot. I gasped and took a step back onto some glass which alerted him to our presence. He turned to me and begged for help. He begged for me to call an ambulance or at least take a message for his kids. He began rambling about how he'd made a colossal mistake, and unfortunately he never got to finish what he was saying. The woman pounced. In the blink of an eye, she was on top of him. Her hand contorted into a claw that wrapped entirely around his face. 13 grotesquely long fingers held his head down as he struggled against her ungodly strength. He tried to fight back, but the weak man's struggles were met with even more force. The creature upon him was determined to lap up every last breath, and I swore I could hear a twisted chuckle as it watched him cling to life. The screams seemed like they went on forever, but in reality, it was quick. Maybe 30 seconds had passed, and he was gone. When she retracted from the body, a quick shine of my phone's light revealed a broken jaw, a twisted nose, and deep bruising around the neck. The woman faced away from me, and for a moment, we both just stood there in that horrible place. I tried to find my voice. I wanted nothing more than the strength to tell her that all I wanted was to go home and pretend like that night was all a nightmare. But I didn't have to. Reminiscent of the way she turned to me on that dark rainy road, She spun around and revealed not just a large smile but a brand new face. One that greatly resembled that of the man she had just taken from this world. Her parting words to me in his voice were, "Thank you very much. Never return here." With that, she simply walked further into the decaying structure. As soon as she was out of sight, I sprinted back to my car and sped all the way home. That night I must have quadruple checked all the locks, taped the curtains down, and left a pile of makeshift weapons by my bed. Every single dream I had for the next month consisted not just of visions of her but of many more creatures like her. And honestly, despite it all, I still never wanted to tell anyone. I want nothing less than to be another random guy throwing a story in the sea of tall tales. I knew that anyone I told this to would roll their eyes and tell me that I'm being ridiculous or that I needed to be drug tested. I'd rather just avoid the scrutiny entirely. But just last week, a man was found dead in his home. Clearly suffocated, jaw and nose broken. No tips have led to anything significant. The police's only hint is a crappy video of some young man who was described as appearing featureless being dropped off near the home. Funnily enough, just last night, I saw a post on one of those community apps saying that someone in the area thought they saw the murdered man walking the streets. Turned out to just be a young man who looked remarkably similar to him. After hearing that story, I think I feel a little less crazy going public with this. To the man I enabled the death of, I'm so sorry. I thought I was doing something good, and as a result, it ended in tragedy. I will never forgive myself for that. I don't know what you were going through, but you deserve so much better. And to the world at large, if you're ever in a situation where someone is trying to hitchhike with you, please, keep driving. The next story of this video. Posted by u/Bryany97. The Dog Man. Sitting alone on the bench at the park, I looked down at my phone to confirm the time, 1:58 a.m. 2 minutes until he arrived. I looked around anxiously, gripping my backpack tight to my chest for a moment before recoiling at the horrific smell emanating from it. 1:59 a.m. I took a deep breath and let out a slow exhale before unzipping my bag. The stench hit me at full force and wafted through the air. I looked down again at my phone and saw the time had hit 2 o'clock. Like clockwork, I heard a rustling in the bushes behind me. A pained groan and cough accompanied the rustling. Stone-faced, I turned around to the sound of the noise and saw the figure responsible. He was taller than the last time I had seen him. He was maybe around 6 feet 6 inches now when previously he had been under 6 feet. He was still rail thin, however. Really nothing more than a skeleton with a thin layer of gray skin that had brown tufts of hair in random patches across his body. He shambled toward me, slowly moving one knock-kneed leg in front of the other. Every time we'd meet, I'd try and keep focused on his body. Still, without fail, my eyes would wander towards his abomination of a face. His bald head appeared human. But if his eyes weren't covered by a dirty blindfold, I'm sure I'd be looking into an empty endless black void. But what always disturbed me the most was his wide mouth that hung open enough for me to see jumbled rows of canine teeth and dog-like molars. A flat tongue flopped out, and I could hear him panting as he came towards me. I stood to face him and put my hand out in front of a beak-like nose for him to sniff me. His wrinkled lips curled into a smile, and he took a step back. He raised up an arm and revealed a poorly formed leg was growing out of the bicep. He pointed the leg at my bag, and in a deep, buzzy voice, asked, "Did you bring it?" Without a word, I reached behind me to grab my backpack and threw it in front of him. As soon as it hit the ground, he got onto all fours and began tearing into the bags of rotten meat that spilled out. I nearly gagged as I watched him choke down the assortment of roadkill and rotten fish I had bought. Once done with his meal, he snapped his head towards me and hung his mouth open again, viscous saliva dripping to the ground in anticipation. I grabbed a second bag from the side of the bench and reached inside to pull out a small container. He stomped the ground with anticipation as I revealed the heart of a dog that I had obtained from a nearby pet cemetery. When I presented it to him, he quickly snatched it out of my hand and forced it down his throat, swallowing the thing whole. He shuddered for a moment and then vomited a black liquid. He then stood back up to his feet and gargled out, "Thank you very much. Your family is safe for the next 30 days. If you disappoint, I will consume you all while you sleep. There will be no forgiveness." I simply nodded in response. Opting to go back down on all fours, he shambled back off into the bushes. I waited a moment to ensure he wouldn't return. I flopped back onto the bench and grabbed for my backpack. Unzipping the first pocket revealed the gun I had bought a year ago. I stared down at it, contemplating why I couldn't bring myself to use it. It's a ritual I practiced after every time I saw him. My mind would flash back to the time we'd been caught. A man walking by himself saw the creature, pulled out his pistol, and unloaded everything he had into the dogman. I watched in horror as the same man laid on the ground with his jaw missing only moments later. The dogman, no worse for wear, crunching away at a new chew toy and of all things, reciting a damn poem. Joyful, joyful, joyful. As only dogs know how to be happy. With only the autonomy of their shameless spirit. He repeated over and over while crunching through the flesh and bone of the man's jaw. Part of me knows I couldn't kill him, but the rest thinks I'm a coward for not trying anyway. Self-defense without the intent of ever defending yourself. Or your family. How mad is that? My eyes drifted from the weapon to the bile left by the dogman. I could see maggots crawling away from the mess. Or at least, maggots are what I'd describe them as. They had to be 3 or 4 times the size of your average maggot at birth and had little limbs that they used to move around. I sighed, got up, and made sure to kill every single one I could find. This curse wouldn't spread if I could help it. Eventually, I could feel myself starting to shut down. I got my stuff, hopped in my car, and drove home, hoping that I could enjoy the next 29 days before I'd have to meet the devil himself again.